For 30 years, he was one of the most respected elders among Jehovah's Witnesses, until a single glance of fear from a young woman exposed a dark secret the organization never wanted revealed. What this elder uncovered could shatter reputations, shake the faith of thousands, and change his life forever. My name is Joseph Miller, and for 30 years I wore the title of elder in the Jehovah's Witness congregation like a badge of honor. Every Thursday evening I'd straighten my navy, see in the mirror, check that my shoes were polished, and gather my leather-bound copies of The Watchtower and Awake. Magazines. The Kingdom Hall in Red Hollow, Ohio, was my second home, maybe even my first, if I'm being honest. The smell of that building still comes to me sometimes. Floor wax mixed with the faint scent of coffee brewing in the back room for the elders' meetings. Those beige walls had heard thousands of my words over the decades: Bible studies, disciplinary meetings, talks about staying faithful to Jehovah's organization. I believed every single word I spoke. Brother Miller always set such a fine example, the circuit overseer had said just 6 months earlier, adjusting his own tie as we stood in the small office behind the main hall. Your congregation is blessed to have such dedicated leadership. I remember feeling that familiar warmth of approval, that sense that I was exactly where God wanted me to be. At 62, I'd spent more of my life in this organization than out of it. My wife Margaret and I had raised our children according to Watchtower guidelines. No birthdays, no Christmas, no college. Everything filtered through the lens of what the organization taught was God's will. Tuesday mornings were my favorite. I'd wake at 5:30 a.m., brew my coffee, and spend an hour preparing for the theocratic ministry school. The kitchen table would be spread with Bible commentaries, organizational letters, and my weekly reports. Margaret would shuffle in around 6:45, already dressed for field service in her modest skirt and sensible shoes. Another blessed day in Jehovah's service, she'd say, the same words every morning for 27 years of marriage. But that Tuesday in October was different. As I sat reviewing the congregation's publisher record cards, tracking each member's monthly field service hours, one name kept standing out: Clara Johnson. For 3 consecutive months, she'd reported 0 hours, no door-to-door preaching, no Bible studies, no informal witnessing, nothing. Clara was 24, baptized at 16, and until recently had been one of our most enthusiastic publishers. She'd auxiliary pioneered every April and August, spending 60 hours each month, sharing the good news with our neighbors. Her field service reports always arrived on time, written in neat cursive on the small slips of paper we used to track our spiritual productivity. Now, silence. I'd noticed other changes too. During meetings, Clara sat in the back row instead of her usual spot near the platform. When brothers approached to greet her, she'd smile politely but step back, maintaining distance. Her comments during the Watchtower study had become rare, and when she did raise her hand, her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe she's just going through a phase, Margaret had suggested when I mentioned my concerns. Young people sometimes lose their spiritual focus. Remember the Thompson boy? He came around. But this felt different. The Thompson boy had been rebellious, challenging, asking difficult questions about blood transfusions and the generation teaching. Clara wasn't rebelling, she was disappearing. Sunday morning, October 15th, I decided to approach her after the meeting. The hall buzzed with the usual post-service chatter as families gathered their belongings and made plans for the afternoon. Clara was near the literature counter, fumbling with her Bible and notebook. "Sister Johnson," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Fear. Not the respectful concern that members typically showed elders, but genuine bone-deep fear. Her eyes darted toward the exit, then back to me, like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. "Brother Miller," she managed, forcing that same polite smile I'd been seeing for months. "I've Been concerned about you, sister. Your field service reports. I've been busy with work, she interrupted, which was unusual. In our culture, you never interrupted an elder, especially during spiritual counsel. Trying to save money, you understand? I nodded, but something in her voice didn't ring true. Clara worked at the local grocery store, the same job she'd held since high school. Her schedule hadn't changed. Her living situation with her elderly aunt hadn't changed. What had? Perhaps we could arrange a shepherding call, I offered. Elder Pierce and I could visit you and your aunt, maybe discuss how to maintain spiritual priorities despite secular pressures. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. At the mention of Harold Pierce's name, Clara's face went pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed her Bible, and she took another step back. That's not necessary, Brother Miller. Really, I'm fine. Just need to get my schedule organized better. She hurried toward the exit before I could respond, leaving me standing by the literature counter with more questions than answers. That afternoon, as I sat in my study reviewing congregation files, I couldn't shake the image of Clara's face when I'd mentioned Harold's name. Elder Harold Pierce was our congregation coordinator, a man in his late 50s who'd held positions of authority for over 20 years. His talks were always well prepared, his field service presentations polished. The circuit overseer frequently used him as an example of faithful service, but Clara's reaction suggested something else entirely. That evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, I sat in my armchair with a cup of decaf coffee growing cold in my hands. Outside, Red Hollow was settling into its autumn routine, porch lights clicking on, the distant sound of television programs filtering through thin walls. Inside our house, the familiar quiet of a faithful Jehovah's Witness household. No worldly entertainment, no holiday preparations, just the soft tick of the wall clock marking time until the new system of things. For the first time in 30 years of eldership, I found myself wondering if I really knew the people I was supposed to be shepherding. And more troubling still, if I really knew the men I was serving alongside. Harold Pierce arrived at our congregation in 1995, transferred from a congregation in Toledo due to what he called family circumstances. He was 42 then, recently, divorced, a situation that required careful review by the circuit overseer before he could retain his elder privileges. The divorce had been scriptural, he assured us, meaning his ex-wife had committed adultery, freeing him to remarry and maintain his position. Brother Pierce brings years of experience in judicial matters, our former coordinator had announced, when introducing Harold to the body of elders. The society has recommended him highly for his discretion in handling sensitive congregation issues. Discretion. That word would echo in my mind for years to come. Harold was tall, maybe 6'2", with graying brown hair that he kept meticulously styled. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his knowledge of Watchtower doctrine encyclopedic. During elders' meetings, he could quote from memory the organization's policies on everything from child discipline to marriage counseling. The other elders respected him, and the brothers in the congregation looked up to him. He has the gift of discernment, Elder Martinez had said after Harold's first judicial committee hearing. We dealt with a young brother caught viewing pornography, a serious matter requiring spiritual surgery, as we called it. Harold had handled the questioning with what seemed like appropriate firmness, tempered by mercy. Over the years, Harold had worked his way up through congregation responsibilities. First, he'd been assigned to the service committee, organizing our door-to-door preaching work. Then the theocratic ministry school, where he trained brothers and sisters in public speaking and Bible presentation. Finally, 3 years ago, he'd been appointed as coordinator, the congregation's top administrative position. But now, sitting in my study Wednesday evening, I was remembering details that hadn't seemed significant at the time. Harold volunteered, frequently for youth activities, organizing camping trips for the young brothers, chaperoning social gatherings, offering to conduct Bible studies with teenage publishers. At the time, I'd admired his dedication to the next generation. Young people need strong male role models, he'd said more than once during our elders' meetings, especially the sisters who don't have spiritual fathers at home. Clara Johnson fit that description perfectly. Her father had died when she was 12, and her mother had never been one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Clara lived with her Aunt Dorothy, a faithful sister in her 70s, who'd been baptized for over 40 years. Aunt Dorothy had raised Clara from age 14, guiding her toward baptism and regular participation in congregation activities. I pulled out my congregation records and spread them across my desk. Clara's publisher record card showed a steady pattern of faithful service from her baptism at 16 until this year. 60 hours of field service during auxiliary pioneer months, consistent book study attendance, regular participation in the ministry school. Then, starting in July, began conducting a special Bible study program for young adults, focusing on maintaining Christian morality in a corrupt world. Clara had been one of 12 young publishers selected for this program, which met Tuesday evenings at the Kingdom Hall. The sessions were designed to address the particular challenges facing Jehovah's Witness youth: dating, career choices, higher education, peer pressure. We need to protect our young ones from the world's influence. Harold had explained to the body of elders when he'd proposed the program. These private sessions will allow for more personal, direct counsel than we can provide in regular meetings. I remember feeling impressed by his initiative. Here was an elder who recognized the spiritual dangers facing our youth and was willing to invest extra time in their development. The other elders had unanimously approved the program. But now I was wondering about those private sessions. Had they really been group studies, or had Harold arranged individual meetings under the guise of special attention? I made a mental note to speak with some of the other young people who'd participated. Thursday evening, after our regular ministry school meeting, I approached Sister Rodriguez, whose 19-year-old daughter Carmen had been part of Harold's study group. How did Carmen enjoy Brother Pierce's special program? I asked casually as we walked toward the parking lot. Sister Rodriguez's expression clouded slightly. She only attended a few sessions, she said. Said she preferred the regular meetings. You know how young people can be. They don't always appreciate the extra effort brothers put in for them. Interesting. Carmen was usually eager for any additional spiritual activity. What had changed her mind about Harold's program? That weekend, I decided to visit Dorothy Johnson. Clara's aunt lived in a small white house on Maple Street, walking distance from the Kingdom Hall. The front porch was decorated with fall mums, and the windows were spotless. The home of a faithful witness sister who took pride in maintaining a clean, orderly environment. Brother Miller. Dorothy's face lit up when she answered the door. What a pleasant surprise. Come in, come in. I just put the kettle on for tea. Dorothy's living room was exactly what I'd expected. Well-worn furniture, arranged around a coffee table stacked with Watchtower and Awake magazines. Family photos on the mantel, including several of Clara at various congregation events, baptism, assemblies, graduation from the ministry school. I wanted to check on Clara, I said, accepting a cup of chamomile tea. I've noticed she hasn't been as active in the ministry lately. Is everything all right at home? Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. At 73, she was showing signs of age, but her mind remained sharp. She'd been one of our most dependable publishers for decades. Clara's been troubled lately, she admitted. Spiritual troubles, I think. She doesn't talk to me much anymore. Spends most of her time in her room when she's not working. Has something specific happened? Sometimes young people go through periods of doubt, especially in today's world. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She asked me once if it was possible for an elder to do something wrong and still remain an elder. A hypothetical question, she said, but the way she asked it, Dorothy trailed off, then looked directly at me. Brother Miller, if an elder was doing something inappropriate, what would happen? Would the organization handle it internally, or would outside authorities be involved? The question hit me like a physical blow. Dorothy was asking about reporting procedures for elder misconduct, not a theoretical inquiry from someone studying Watchtower policy, but the desperate question of someone who suspected something serious was happening. Sister Dorothy, has Clara told you about a specific situation involving an elder? The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. She won't tell me details, just that she doesn't feel safe in certain situations anymore, that she wants to stop attending the extra meetings, but doesn't know how to say no without causing trouble. Extra meetings, Harold's Tuesday evening program. Would you like me to speak with Clara directly? I offered. Dorothy nodded gratefully. Please, Brother Miller. Something is wrong, and I don't know how to help her. She respects you. Maybe she'll open up to you about whatever is troubling her. As I drove home that evening, pieces of a troubling puzzle were beginning to form a picture I didn't want to see. Clara's withdrawal from congregation activities, her fear when Harold's name was mentioned, Carmen Rodriguez leaving the Tuesday study program early, Dorothy's careful questions about reporting procedures. Margaret was reading her daily text. When I walked into our living room, she looked up expectantly. How was your visit with Sister Dorothy? I sat down heavily in my recliner, suddenly feeling every one of my 62 years. Margaret, if you discovered that a fellow elder was behaving inappropriately toward a young sister, what would you want me to do? My wife set down her Watchtower publication, her expression serious. Report it to the other elders immediately, of course. Let the organization handle it according to theocratic procedures. And if those procedures weren't adequate to protect the young sister. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. Joseph, I've been praying about Clara Johnson. Something in my spirit tells me she's in distress. If an elder is causing that distress. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Our first responsibility is to protect the sheep, isn't it? For the first time since becoming an elder, I wondered if protecting the sheep might require going against the organization's preferred procedures. And for the first time in 30 years of faithful service, that possibility didn't terrify me. It felt necessary. The next morning, Friday, I called in sick to my job at the hardware store, something I rarely did. Instead, I drove to the congregations and territory and parked outside Clara's workplace, Miller's Market, a small grocery store where she'd been employed since graduating high school. I waited until her lunch break, watching through the large front windows as she restocked shelves with the methodical precision of someone trying to lose themselves in routine tasks. When she finally emerged through the side door, I approached, carefully, not wanting to startle her. Clara, could we talk for a few minutes? She looked around nervously, as if checking to see who might observe us together. Is this about my field service reports, Brother Miller? Because I told you I've been busy. No, sister, this is about making sure you're safe. The word safe stopped her mid-sentence. She studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether I could be trusted. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks down, she said finally. Neutral ground. 20 minutes later, we sat across from each other in a booth at Rosie's Diner, a place where no witness would expect to find us during a weekday afternoon. Clara ordered black coffee and barely touched it. Her hands remained folded in her lap, and she kept glancing toward the door. Your Aunt Dorothy is worried about you, I began gently. She says you've been troubled lately. She mentioned that you'd asked her about procedures regarding elder conduct. Clara's face went white. I never should have said anything to her. She's an old woman. She doesn't need to worry. Clara, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to trust that I'm asking because I want to help, not because I want to cause problems. Has Elder Pierce done or said anything that made you uncomfortable? The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Clara's composure cracked, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. He said no one would believe me, she whispered. He said I was imagining things, that I was letting Satan put impure thoughts in my mind. He said if I told anyone, it would prove I was spiritually weak. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to remain calm. What exactly happened? Clara? Through halting words and frequent pauses to compose herself, Clara told me about the Tuesday evening study sessions. How they'd started as group meetings, but had gradually become individual counseling sessions. How Harold had begun touching her shoulder, then her hand, then suggesting they pray together with his arm around her. How the touching had progressed to inappropriate places during these prayer sessions. He always had a scripture ready, Clara said, her voice barely audible, about submission, about respecting those taking the lead, about not causing divisions in the congregation. He said Jehovah was testing my loyalty through him. Have you told anyone else about this? I tried to tell my cousin Rebecca. You know her. She goes to the North congregation. She said I should be grateful that an elder was taking special interest in my spiritual development. She said I was probably misunderstanding his motives. I felt sick, not just because of what Harold had done, but because our organizational culture had trained Clara and her cousin to doubt her own perceptions when they conflicted with the assumed righteousness of appointed men. Clara, what Harold did to you was wrong. It was abuse, and it was not from Jehovah. You were not imagining things, and you are not spiritually weak. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and fear. But what can we do? The organization requires 2 witnesses for accusations against an elder. It was just me and him in that room. I knew the Watchtower's interpretation of 1 Timothy 5:19. Do not accept an accusation against an elder unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. The organization applied this literally, meaning that without multiple witnesses to the actual misconduct, no action could be taken against an elder, even in cases of sexual abuse. Clara, some things are more important than organizational procedures. Your safety is more important. We talked for another hour. Clara revealed that Harold had told her other young sisters in nearby congregations had received similar special training, and that she should feel honored to be chosen. She also mentioned that Carmen Rodriguez had confided in her before leaving the Tuesday program early. Carmen had experienced similar inappropriate behavior, but had been too frightened to report it. As we prepared to leave, Clara grabbed my arm. Brother Miller, please don't let this destroy the congregation. Whatever you decide to do, please remember that there are good people there who don't deserve to have their faith shaken. Her concern for others, even while dealing with her own trauma, reminded me why I'd become an elder in the first place, to protect and shepherd people exactly like Clara Johnson. That evening, I sat in my study with a legal pad and began making notes, not just about what Clara had told me, but about patterns I'd observed over Harold's 7 years in our congregation. Young sisters who'd stopped participating in activities after working closely with him. Publisher record cards showing sudden drops in field service for certain individuals. Comments from parents about their daughters preferring not to work with Harold in door-to-door service. Margaret knocked on my study door around 9 p.m. Joseph, you've been in here for hours. Are you all right? I looked up at my wife of 27 years. This faithful woman who'd trusted our organization to guide every aspect of our lives. Tomorrow, everything would change for us, but tonight, I needed to prepare for what was coming. Margaret, I need to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to hear. Margaret's reaction to Clara's story was everything I'd hoped for and feared. She wept, Not the gentle tears of sympathy we'd shed over tragic news from the platform, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose worldview was collapsing in real time. For 27 years, she'd trusted the organization's appointment process implicitly. If a man was appointed as an elder, it meant Jehovah's Spirit had guided that decision. "How could this happen, Joseph?" she asked through her tears. "How could the Holy Spirit allow such a man to be appointed?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't shake her faith even further. Instead, I held her until she stopped trembling, and then we prayed together. Not the scripted prayers we'd learned from Watchtower publications, but desperate, broken pleas for wisdom and strength. Saturday morning, I called Elder Martinez and Elder Thompson, the other two members of our congregation's body of elders besides Harold and myself. I suggested we meet for lunch at the Cracker Barrel on the highway, neutral territory, away from the Kingdom Hall, where Harold might unexpectedly appear. "Brothers, I need to discuss a serious matter concerning one of our publishers," I began after we'd ordered our meals. "I've received information about inappropriate conduct by a member of our elder body." Martinez, a retired mechanic who'd served as an elder for 15 years, set down his coffee cup with a slight tremor. Thompson, younger at 51, and the most recent appointment to our body, leaned forward with concern. "What kind of inappropriate conduct?" Thompson asked. I chose my words carefully, knowing that how I presented this information would determine their initial response. "Sexual misconduct toward a young sister in the congregation. Multiple incidents over several months." The silence that followed felt heavy with implications. Finally, Martinez spoke. "Do we have the required number of witnesses as outlined in the flock book?" He was referring to our confidential elder manual, Shepherd the Flock of God, which contained detailed procedures for handling judicial matters. "We have the victim's testimony and corroborating evidence of a pattern of behavior," I replied. "But no, we don't have 2 eyewitnesses to the actual misconduct." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Brother Miller, you know the Society's position on this. Without 2 witnesses, we can't form a judicial committee against an elder. It would be one person's word against another's." "But what if there are multiple victims?" I pressed. "What if this isn't an isolated incident?" Martinez and Thompson exchanged a look that told me they were already calculating the risks to congregation stability. This was exactly what I'd feared. Good men, faithful elders, but men who'd been trained to prioritize organizational procedures over individual protection. "Even so," Martinez said carefully, "we'd need to follow proper theocratic order. Any accusations against Harold would need to be reported to the circuit overseer before we could take action." I knew what that meant. The circuit overseer, Brother Williams, was a company man who'd spent 30 years climbing the organizational hierarchy. His first instinct would be to protect the society from scandal, not to protect Clara from further harm. "Brothers, while we're following proper procedures, what happens to the sister who came forward? What if Harold realizes she's spoken up? What if there are other victims who are too frightened to come forward because they see how we handle the first one?" Thompson, to his credit, looked genuinely troubled. "What are you suggesting, Joseph?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes protecting the sheep requires us to act decisively, even if it means going beyond organizational procedures." The word "beyond" hung in the air like an accusation. In Watchtower culture, going beyond organizational guidance was tantamount to apostasy, the unforgivable sin of independent thinking. Our lunch ended with an agreement to pray about the matter and reconvene Monday evening. But I could see in their eyes that Martinez and Thompson had already made their choice. They would follow organizational protocol, regardless of the cost to Clara or any other potential victims. Sunday morning's meeting was torture. I sat on the platform during the Watchtower study, watching Harold conduct the meeting with his usual polished confidence. When he called on Clara to comment on paragraph 12, about trusting in Jehovah's organization, I saw her hands shake as she declined to participate. "Sister Johnson prefers to listen today," Harold announced with a benevolent smile. "Sometimes quiet meditation is just as valuable as vocal participation." The patronizing tone made my stomach turn. After the meeting, I watched Harold approach several young sisters, offering encouragement and scheduling follow-up visits. How many others had he targeted? How many had suffered in silence, believing that questioning an elder's conduct was spiritual weakness? That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I drove to Clara's workplace and asked to speak with her privately. We met again at Rosie's diner, where she looked even more fragile than she had 3 days earlier. "Clara, I've spoken with the other elders about your situation," I began. Her face went white. "You told them? Brother Miller, you promised." "I didn't mention your name. I presented it as a hypothetical situation. But Clara, I need you to understand something. The organization's procedures are going to protect Harold, not you. Even if other elders believe your account, they won't act without 2 witnesses to the actual abuse." Tears began flowing down her cheeks again. "So that's it? He just continues doing this to other girls?" "Not if we take this outside organizational channels." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. "You mean the police?" I nodded. "And possibly the media. This needs to be exposed, Clara, not just for you, but for every other young woman Harold might target. But I'll be disfellowshipped. My aunt will be forced to shun me. I'll lose everyone I've ever known." She was right. The Watchtower's policy was clear. Members who brought reproach on the organization by involving outside authorities in internal matters faced expulsion and complete social ostracism. Clara would lose her family, her friends, her entire support system. "I know what I'm asking you to risk," I said quietly, "and I know what I'm risking by suggesting it. But Clara, some things are more important than maintaining our position in the organization." We talked for 2 hours. Clara revealed more details about Harold's behavior, how he'd used his authority to isolate her, how he'd manipulated scripture to justify his actions, how he'd threatened her with spiritual consequences if she reported him. She also confirmed my suspicions about other victims. Carmen Rodriguez told me he did similar things to her during their private study sessions, Clara said. "And there's a girl named Ashley in the North congregation who stopped attending meetings altogether after working with Harold on a convention presentation. Would Carmen be willing to come forward? Maybe, if she knew she wasn't alone. But Brother Miller, her family has been in the truth for 3 generations. If she gets disfellowshipped for this..." I understood. Carmen's entire extended family were Jehovah's Witnesses. Speaking out would mean losing not just friends, but parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, everyone who mattered to her. Monday evening's elder meeting took place in the Kingdom Hall's small library, a cramped room, lined with Watchtower publications dating back to the 1950s. We were discussing truth and justice, surrounded by decades of organizational literature that had consistently prioritized institutional protection over individual welfare. I'd prepared carefully for this meeting, bringing copies of Clara's written statement and a timeline of Harold's suspicious behavior patterns. But before I could present my evidence, Martinez spoke up. "Brothers, I've been in prayer about our discussion Saturday, and I believe we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Brother Williams is visiting our circuit next month for the circuit assembly. Perhaps this matter should wait until then, so we can receive proper guidance from the circuit overseer." Thompson nodded agreement. "That would give us time to pray about this and make sure we're handling things according to theocratic order." "Time for what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Time for Harold to abuse other young women, time for Clara to suffer in silence, time for the victims to lose courage and decide not to come forward. "Joseph," Martinez said, using my first name instead of the formal Brother Miller, a subtle sign of disapproval. Your concern for the sister is commendable, but we can't let emotion override proper procedures. If we act hastily, we could destroy an innocent brother's reputation based on unsubstantiated accusations. Unsubstantiated! I pulled out Clara's written statement. This young woman has provided detailed accounts of multiple incidents, including dates, times, and specific conversations. She's identified other potential victims. What more substantiation do you need? Thompson leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone elders used when correcting spiritual weakness. We need what the scriptures require, Joseph. 2 or 3 witnesses. Without that, we're just spreading gossip that could damage the congregation and bring reproach on Jehovah's name. There it was, the ultimate trump card in any Watchtower discussion. Bringing reproach on Jehovah's name was presented as the worst possible outcome, worse than allowing abuse to continue, worse than failing to protect victims. The organization had trained us to fear scandal more than injustice. Let me ask you both a question, I said, closing Clara's statement and looking directly at my fellow elders. If Clara Johnson were your daughter and Harold Pierce had done these things to her, would you still insist on waiting for organizational procedures? The question hung in the air for several moments. Finally, Martinez answered, but his voice lacked conviction. I would trust in Jehovah's organization to handle the matter appropriately, but Thompson's expression had changed. For just a moment, I saw doubt flicker across his face, the brief recognition that organizational loyalty and paternal protection might be incompatible. The meeting ended with a decision to table the matter pending the circuit overseer's visit. As we gathered our materials, I made one final attempt. Brothers, what if Harold realizes that someone has made accusations against him? What if he becomes more careful, more secretive? What if he transfers to another congregation where no one knows to watch for warning signs? Neither Martinez nor Thompson had an answer for that. Tuesday evening, I sat in my car outside the Kingdom Hall during what should have been Harold's youth study program. Through the windows, I could see him setting up chairs in the auxiliary room, preparing for another session with young publishers who trusted him to guide their spiritual development. Clara had stopped attending the program 3 weeks earlier, claiming schedule conflicts. Carmen Rodriguez had never returned after her brief participation, but there were still 8 young people on Harold's roster, 8 potential victims who had no idea they were in danger. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number for the Ohio Attorney General's office. When the receptionist answered, I took a deep breath and said the words that would end my 30-year career as a Jehovah's Witness elder. I need to report suspected child abuse by a religious leader. The decision was made. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally doing the right thing. Wednesday morning, I met with Detective Sarah Chen of the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, a woman in her early 40s who specialized in cases involving religious organizations. Her office was stark but comfortable, with certificates on the walls and family photos on her desk. Mr. Miller, she began, I understand you want to report suspected abuse within your religious congregation. I spent 2 hours walking Detective Chen through everything I knew. Clara's statement, Harold's behavior patterns, the organizational policies that had prevented internal action, the potential existence of other victims. She took detailed notes and asked probing questions that demonstrated her familiarity with institutional abuse cases. Are you aware that by making this report, you're likely to face significant backlash from your religious community? She asked near the end of our meeting. I am. But Detective Chen, if we don't stop this now, Harold Pierce will continue abusing young women and the organization will continue protecting him. I can't live with that on my conscience. She handed me her card and explained the next steps. Clara would need to make a formal statement. Other potential victims would be interviewed. A warrant would be issued for Harold's arrest once they had sufficient evidence. Mr. Miller, I want you to know that what you're doing takes considerable courage. Many religious abuse cases go unreported because community members are afraid to come forward. That evening, I called Clara and arranged to meet her at Detective Chen's office the following day. Then I sat down with Margaret to explain what I'd set in motion. "They'll disfellowship us," she said quietly after I'd finished. "Probably. We'll lose all our friends. Yes. The children will be pressured not to speak with us. Our adult children lived in other states, both faithful witnesses, with families of their own. Disfellowshipping would mean losing contact with our grandchildren." Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring out our kitchen window at the Kingdom Hall visible in the distance. Finally, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Joseph, do you remember why we became Jehovah's Witnesses?" I nodded. "We were searching for truth, for a way to serve God that made sense. And do you believe we're serving God by protecting Clara Johnson and other young women from a predator?" "Yes, I do." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Then we do what's right, regardless of the consequences." Thursday afternoon, Clara gave her statement to Detective Chen. Friday morning, Carmen Rodriguez agreed to be interviewed after. Clara assured her she wouldn't face the situation alone. By Friday evening, 2 other young women from nearby congregations had contacted the sheriff's office. The warrant for Harold Pierce's arrest was issued the following Monday. The phone rang at 6:23 a.m. on Tuesday, jolting me from restless sleep. I recognized the number immediately. Kingdom Hall office line. Margaret stirred beside me as I answered with a cautious, "Hello." "Joseph, it's Martinez. We need to see you at the hall immediately. There's been a development." The tone in his voice told me everything. Harold had been arrested. I dressed quickly, kissing Margaret goodbye, with the knowledge that this might be the last normal morning we'd share for a very long time. The drive to the Kingdom Hall took 8 minutes. 8 minutes to prepare myself for the confrontation that would define the rest of my life. Harold's silver Buick was conspicuously absent from the parking lot. In its place sat an unfamiliar sedan that I assumed belonged to Brother Williams, our circuit overseer, who apparently had made an emergency visit to deal with what the organization would undoubtedly call a crisis of faith, rather than what it actually was, a crisis of conscience. I found them in the main auditorium, Martinez, Thompson, Brother Williams, and a man I didn't recognize, but whose demeanor screamed, "Watchtower Legal Department." They sat in the front row like a tribunal, with an empty chair positioned directly in front of them. "Brother Miller," Williams began without preamble, "please sit down." Brother Williams was a thin man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time in windowless meeting rooms. I'd known him for 7 years, had shared meals in my home with him, had considered him a spiritual father. Now he looked at me with the cold assessment of a prosecutor. "Joseph, we know what you've done." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. No greeting, no prayer, no pretense of brotherly concern. Just the blunt reality that my actions had been discovered and judged. "Harold Pierce was arrested yesterday evening," Williams continued, "charged with sexual assault of a minor, abuse of authority, and other offenses that will bring tremendous reproach on Jehovah's name. The arrest warrant specifically mentions information provided by congregation members." I met his gaze steadily. "Yes, it does." The unnamed man in the expensive suit leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, I'm Brother Patterson from the Watchtower's legal department. We need to understand exactly what information you provided to law enforcement and what prompted you to circumvent established theocratic procedures." "I provided truthful information about crimes committed against members of our congregation," I replied. "And I did so because established theocratic procedures were inadequate to protect and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I'd seen him use before when he was particularly displeased with local elders' decisions." "Joseph, you violated one of the most fundamental principles of theocratic organization. We handle matters internally through proper channels, with prayer and reliance on Jehovah's Spirit. By involving secular authorities, you've demonstrated a lack of faith in God's arrangement. I've demonstrated faith in God's commandment to protect the innocent, I countered. The same God who gave us consciences to distinguish right from wrong. Patterson consulted a folder thick with documents. According to our records, no formal complaint was ever filed with the elder body regarding Harold Pierce's conduct. No judicial committee was formed. No investigation was conducted according to established procedures. You acted unilaterally, based on uncorroborated allegations. The allegations were corroborated by multiple victims. The only thing uncorroborated was the organization's willingness to act on them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thompson, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Joseph, Harold has confessed to some indiscretions, but he's expressed deep repentance. There might have been a path forward through internal discipline if you hadn't involved outside authorities. Indiscretions. I stood up, no longer able to contain my anger. Sexual assault of young women is an indiscretion. Abuse of religious authority to prey on vulnerable congregation members is an indiscretion. Sit down, Brother Miller, Williams commanded. Your emotional outburst only confirms our concerns about your spiritual condition. I remained standing. My spiritual condition? What about Harold's spiritual condition when he was manipulating scriptures to justify sexual abuse? What about the spiritual condition of an organization that's more concerned with its reputation than with protecting victims? Patterson made notes on a legal pad. Mr. Miller, your statements here today will be part of the record. I strongly advise you to consider the ramifications of continuing down this path. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you that apostasy is a serious charge. Speaking against God's organization, undermining theocratic authority, causing divisions in the congregation, these actions have consequences. Williams put his glasses back on and opened his own folder. Joseph, you've served as an elder for 30 years. You've been a pillar of this congregation, a man respected by your brothers and sisters. We don't want to lose you, but we cannot allow rebellion against theocratic order to go unaddressed. What are you proposing? A public statement of repentance. Acknowledgement that you acted hastily and without proper authorization, a commitment to support whatever disciplinary action the organization deems appropriate for Harold's situation, and your resignation from the elder body, effective immediately. The offer was presented as mercy, but I recognized it for what it was: organizational damage control. They wanted to minimize scandal by portraying my actions as misguided zeal, rather than justified whistleblowing. And if I refuse? Williams exchanged glances with Patterson before answering. Then we'll have no choice but to form a judicial committee to address charges of apostasy, causing divisions and bringing reproach on Jehovah's name. The likely outcome would be disfellowshipping. There it was, the nuclear option. Complete expulsion from the only community I'd known for 3 decades, social death, the loss of every friendship, every family relationship, every connection that had defined my identity. I looked around the Kingdom Hall auditorium where I delivered hundreds of talks, conducted dozens of Bible studies, counseled countless congregation members through their spiritual struggles. This building had been more than a meeting place. It had been the center of my universe. I need to ask you something, I said, breaking the heavy silence. Do you believe Harold Pierce committed the crimes he's been charged with? Williams hesitated. What Harold may have done is between him and Jehovah. That's not what I asked. Do you believe he sexually assaulted Clara Johnson and other young women? Thompson answered, when Williams remained silent. The evidence suggests that Harold made some serious errors in judgment. Errors in judgment? He's admitted to sexual assault, and you're calling it errors in judgment? Patterson closed his folder with a sharp snap. Mr. Miller, this line of questioning is unproductive. The issue before us isn't Harold's guilt or innocence. That's for the courts to determine. The issue is your decision to bypass theocratic channels and involve secular authorities in congregation matters. I sat back down, suddenly feeling the weight of 62 years and 30 years of faithful service to an organization that was now treating me like an enemy. Brothers, let me tell you what really happened. A young woman came to me, terrified and traumatized by sexual abuse from a man she'd been taught to respect and obey without question. She begged for help. When I brought this to the elder body, you insisted on procedures that would have protected her abuser and silenced her voice. So I made a choice, to protect the victim rather than the institution. Williams leaned forward. And do you still believe that was the correct choice? I thought of Clara, who had slept peacefully for the first time in months after giving her statement to Detective Chen. I thought of Carmen Rodriguez, who had found the courage to come forward only after learning she wasn't alone. I thought of the other victims who were finally being heard instead of silenced. Yes, I do. The finality in my voice seemed to settle the matter. Williams closed his folder and stood up. Joseph Miller, you are hereby removed from your position as elder, effective immediately. A judicial committee will be formed to address the charges against you. You'll be notified of the hearing date within the week. As they filed out of the auditorium, Martinez paused beside my chair. Joseph, it doesn't have to end this way. Even now, if you expressed genuine repentance, I looked up at this man who had served alongside me for 15 years, who had eaten at my table, who had prayed with me over congregation challenges. Miguel, what would I be repenting for? Protecting children, stopping a predator, choosing justice over organizational loyalty? He couldn't answer. He simply shook his head and walked away. I remained alone in the empty Kingdom Hall for another 20 minutes, surrounded by the silence of a building that had once felt sacred, but now felt hollow. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. Detective Chen called. 3 more victims have come forward. Harold's being charged with additional counts. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Whatever happened to me, whatever consequences I faced, Harold Pierce's reign of terror was over. Clara Johnson and the other victims would have their day in court. Justice would be served, even if it cost me everything I'd once held dear. As I walked toward the parking lot, I realized I wasn't walking away from God. I was walking toward a clearer understanding of what serving God actually meant. The Judicial Committee hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening, 7 p.m. sharp. Margaret and I spent the intervening days in a strange limbo, officially still Jehovah's Witnesses, but already treated like pariahs by congregation members who had somehow learned about my betrayal of organizational loyalty. Wednesday afternoon, Sister Rodriguez called our house. Margaret answered, and I could hear the conversation from my study. Sister Miller, I wanted you to know that Carmen told me everything. What Brother Miller did, it was the right thing. I know it's going to cost your family dearly, but please tell him that one mother is grateful. That evening, as we prepared for what might be our final night as Jehovah's Witnesses, Margaret asked me something I hadn't expected. Joseph, do you regret becoming one of Jehovah's Witnesses? I considered the question carefully. No. The organization gave us community, purpose, a framework for understanding life. It brought us together, helped us raise our children with moral values. But Margaret, somewhere along the way, the organization became more important than the principles it claimed to represent. She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I've been thinking about that too. When did protecting the organization become more important than protecting people? Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October. Margaret wanted to accompany me to the hearing, but I convinced her to stay home. Whatever happened in that back room, I didn't want her to witness the systematic dismantling of 30 years of faithful service. The Kingdom Hall parking lot was fuller than usual for a Thursday evening. Word had clearly spread about the proceedings. I recognized cars belonging to curious congregation members who normally wouldn't attend weeknight meetings. My disgrace had become entertainment. The Judicial Committee consisted of 3 elders, Williams as chairman, plus 2 elders from nearby, congregations whom I'd never met, Brother Stevens from North Hamilton and Brother Foster from West Side. The anonymity was intentional. These men had no personal investment in the outcome, no friendship to cloud their judgment. They had arranged 5 chairs in the auxiliary room, 3 for the committee members, facing 2 chairs for Margaret and me. When I entered alone, Stevens looked surprised. "Where is Sister Miller? We expected both of you to be present." My wife supports my actions completely, but I asked her to stay home. "This is my responsibility." Williams gestured to the single. "Let's begin with prayer." The prayer was perfunctory, a request for divine guidance that felt more like a formality than genuine supplication. When Williams finished, Foster opened a folder thick with documentation. "Brother Miller, and I use that title for possibly the last time, you stand accused of apostasy, causing divisions in the congregation, and bringing reproach upon Jehovah's name. How do you answer these charges?" I had prepared for this moment, but sitting in that sterile room under fluorescent lights, facing 3 men who had already decided my fate, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. "I deny the charges as presented," I said quietly. "I have not spoken against Bible truth. I have not caused divisions except in the sense that truth sometimes divides people, and I have not brought reproach upon God's name, though I may have brought scrutiny upon organizational policies that needed examining." Stevens consulted his notes. "You contacted secular authorities about congregation matters without authorization from the elder body. You encouraged a young sister to file criminal charges against a fellow elder. You undermined theocratic procedures by taking matters into your own hands. Are these facts accurate?" "The facts are accurate. My interpretation of their meaning differs from yours." Williams removed his glasses, that familiar gesture that now seemed threatening rather than thoughtful. "Joseph, let me read you something from our correspondence file." He produced a letter bearing the distinctive letterhead of Watchtower Bible and Tract Society headquarters in Brooklyn. "This is from the service department, dated yesterday. It states, and I quote, Brother Miller's actions represent a dangerous precedent that could undermine the authority structure Jehovah has established through his organization. If congregation members begin involving secular authorities in internal matters, it could result in widespread persecution of God's people and interference with our worship activities. The letter continued for several paragraphs, but I stopped listening after the first few sentences. This wasn't about Harold Pierce's crimes or Clara Johnson's suffering. It was about maintaining organizational control at all costs. Brothers, I said when Williams finished reading, may I ask you a question? Foster nodded cautiously. Do you believe Harold Pierce sexually assaulted Clara Johnson? The three men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Stevens answered, What we believe about Harold's guilt or innocence is irrelevant. He will face Jehovah's judgment for his actions. Our concern is with your failure to trust in theocratic procedures. But it's not irrelevant to Clara, or to the other victims, or to the young women who might have been next if Harold hadn't been stopped. Williams leaned forward. Joseph, do you believe that Jehovah's organization is directed by Holy Spirit? The question was a trap, and we all knew it. Answer yes, and I'd be admitting that the Holy Spirit had appointed Harold Pierce as an elder and guided the organizational policies that protected him. Answer no, and I'd be confessing to apostasy. I believe God's Spirit works through imperfect humans in imperfect systems. I said carefully. But I also believe that claiming divine authorization doesn't exempt us from accountability when our actions harm innocent people. Foster made notes furiously. That answer would be quoted in my disfellowshipping announcement as evidence of apostasy, questioning the organization's claim to divine direction. The hearing continued for 2 hours. They presented evidence of my rebellious attitude, my failure to wait for organizational direction, my encouragement of Clara to involve law enforcement, my refusal to accept that Harold's case should be handled internally. They read statements from Martinez and Thompson describing my emotional outbursts during elder meetings. When they finished presenting their case, Williams asked if I had anything to say in my defense. "I want to read something," I said, pulling out a letter from my jacket pocket. "This is from Clara Johnson, written yesterday." Williams started to object, but I continued reading. "Dear Brother Miller, I know that tonight you will face judgment from men who believe they speak for God. I want you to know that you spoke for God when you chose to protect me instead of protecting the organization that failed me. You showed me what Christian love actually looks like. Not the conditional love that depends on obedience to human authority, but the sacrificial love that puts others' welfare above your own comfort. Whatever they decide about your standing in their organization, please know that you will always be a true Christian in my eyes." The room was silent when I finished reading. Foster cleared his throat and said, "Brother Miller, letters from emotionally disturbed individuals are not relevant to these proceedings." Emotionally disturbed. She's a crime victim who found the courage to speak truth. If that makes her emotionally disturbed, what does protecting her abuser make you? Williams slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough. Your disrespectful attitude toward this committee confirms everything we suspected about your spiritual condition. They dismissed me while they deliberated, a formality, since their decision had been made before I'd entered the room. I sat in my car for 45 minutes, watching congregation members arrive for the book study that was starting in the main auditorium. Several people I'd known for decades walked past without acknowledging my presence. When they called me back, the atmosphere had shifted from interrogation to execution. Williams stood to deliver their verdict. "Joseph Miller, this judicial committee finds you guilty of apostasy, causing divisions in the congregation and bringing reproach upon Jehovah's name. You are hereby disfellowshipped from the congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, effective immediately. This decision is final and not subject to appeal." I felt oddly relieved. The suspense was over, the pretense ended. I was now officially what I'd been treated as for the past week, an enemy of the organization I'd served faithfully for 30 years. "The announcement will be made at next Sunday's meeting," Williams continued. "Until then, you are not to have any contact with congregation members except immediate family, and even that should be limited to necessary family business." As I stood to leave, Foster spoke for the first time since delivering the verdict. "Brother Miller, Joseph, it doesn't have to end this way. Even now, if you express genuine repentance for your actions." I turned back to face the three men who had just excommunicated me from my faith community. What actions should I repent of? Protecting sexual abuse victims, stopping a predator, choosing justice over institutional loyalty? None of them answered. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through downtown Red Hollow. Main Street looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Same storefronts, same traffic patterns, same autumn decorations in store windows. But everything had changed for me. Margaret was waiting in our living room, her eyes red from crying. She didn't need to ask about the outcome. My expression told her everything. "They disfellowshipped me," I said simply. She nodded, stood up, and wrapped her arms around me. We held each other for a long time without speaking. "What happens now?" she finally asked. Now we rebuild our lives outside the organization. We find new ways to serve God that don't require us to choose between institutional loyalty and basic human decency. That night I called Detective Chen to update her on the evening's events. She thanked me again for my cooperation and informed me that Harold had accepted a plea bargain. 15 years in prison in exchange for guilty pleas to multiple counts of sexual assault and abuse of authority. Mr. Miller, I want you to know that your decision to come forward has prevented Harold Pierce from victimizing others. The 3 additional women who came forward after Clara's statement have all expressed gratitude for your courage. After hanging up, I sat in my study, surrounded by 30 years of Watchtower publications, books, magazines, organizational letters, judicial committee guides. Tomorrow, I would box them up and donate them to the Kingdom Hall Library. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed them. For the first time in decades, I would be free to read the Bible without organizational filters, to develop my own understanding of God's will, to serve others without checking first with headquarters in Brooklyn. The phone rang around 11 p.m. I almost didn't answer, assuming it would be another curious congregation member calling for details about my disfellowshipping, but it was my son David calling from Seattle. Dad, I heard about what happened. Some of the brothers out here have been talking. I braced myself for disappointment, anger, or worse, the dutiful shunning that the organization would now require from my own children. Dad, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. The words hit me like a physical force. David continued, I know what this cost you. I know what it's going to cost our whole family. But what you did, it was the right thing. It was what Jesus would have done. We talked until almost 1 a.m., the first honest conversation I'd had with my son in years. He confessed his own growing doubts about organizational policies, his discomfort with the treatment of victims, his gradual realization that faithfulness to God might require unfaithfulness to the organization that claimed to represent him. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, he said before we hung up. But I know I can't pretend anymore that everything is fine waiting for me to finish the call. I covered her with her favorite blanket and stood looking at this woman who had chosen to stand with me despite knowing it would cost her everything she'd held dear. Tomorrow would bring the announcement of my disfellowshipping. Sunday would bring the awkward silence of friends who could no longer acknowledge my existence. Next week would bring the difficult task of rebuilding a social life, a spiritual community, a sense of purpose outside the only framework we'd known as adults. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've chosen correctly when every choice was painful. Sunday morning, October 29th, 2017. Margaret and I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, a luxury we'd never allowed ourselves during meeting mornings. Through our window, we could see congregation members walking toward the Kingdom Hall, families dressed in their meeting clothes, children carrying their book bags. At exactly 10:15 a.m., our landline phone rang. It was Sister Patterson from 3 blocks away, an elderly woman who'd been like a grandmother to our children. Joseph, she whispered, I just wanted you to know that they made the announcement. Joseph Miller is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. No explanation, no details. Just that one sentence, the old sister was crying. I've known you for 20 years, Joseph. I know what kind of man you are. Whatever happened, I know you did what you thought was right. She hung up quickly before anyone could overhear her. Unauthorized communication with a disfellowshipped person. Margaret squeezed my hand. How do you feel? I considered the question seriously. How did I feel about being officially expelled from the only religious community I'd known as an adult? Free, I said, surprising myself with the answer. For the first time in 30 years, I feel free. The weeks following my disfellowshipping were strange and painful. Friends of decades crossed the street to avoid greeting me. Former Bible students I'd helped bring into the organization acted as if I'd become invisible. The mailman, Brother Johnson, who had chatted with me every morning for 15 years, now delivered mail without making eye contact. But there were unexpected sources of support. Dr. Patricia Williams, my physician for 10 years, called to say she'd heard about my situation through the community grapevine. "Mr. Miller, I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage. I've seen too many cases of religious organizations protecting abusers at the expense of victims," she referred me to a support group for former members of high-control religious groups that met monthly at the community center. I was reluctant to attend at first. It felt like betraying my former faith, but Margaret encouraged me to go. "Joseph, you need to talk to people who understand what you're going through. I can support you, but I can't fully comprehend what it's like to lose a religious identity that's been central to your life for 3 decades. The support group included former Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Mormons, people who'd left fundamentalist Christian churches, and several survivors of other high-control groups. Our backgrounds were different, but our experiences of shunning, identity, reconstruction, and social isolation were remarkably similar. "The hardest part isn't losing the beliefs," said Maria, a woman who'd been disfellowshipped 2 years earlier for questioning blood transfusion policies after her daughter died in a car accident. "It's losing your entire social world overnight. Every friendship, every support system gone." David, my son in Seattle, called regularly during those first months. His own faith crisis was accelerating, spurred partly by watching his father's treatment by the organization. "Dad, I've been doing research on the organization's history, things they don't publish in the official literature. Did you know about the United Nations scandal? The organizational membership they kept secret for years while teaching us that the UN was part of Satan's system. These conversations were bittersweet. I was grateful for David's support and his intellectual honesty, but I knew his awakening would likely cost him his marriage. His wife, Sarah, was a third-generation witness whose entire extended family was deeply involved in the organization. In November, I received an unexpected letter. The return address showed Clara Johnson's name, but she'd moved to Columbus and was using her maiden name instead of her married name. "Dear Mr. Miller," the letter began, "I thought you should know that Harold Pierce accepted a plea bargain and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge specifically mentioned your cooperation with the investigation as instrumental in achieving justice for the victims. I also wanted you to know that I've started college, something I never thought possible while I was still in the organization. I'm studying social work, hoping to help other abuse survivors. Your example showed me that sometimes protecting others requires personal sacrifice, and I want my life to honor that lesson." Clara's letter continued with updates about the other victims. Carmen Rodriguez had also left the organization and was receiving therapy. The 2 women from neighboring congregations had found the courage to testify at Harold's sentencing, describing the long-term trauma of his abuse and the additional damage caused by organizational policies that had protected him. Margaret and I began attending a small non-denominational church in downtown Red Hollow. Pastor Williams, no relation to our former circuit overseer, was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who emphasized community service over doctrinal conformity. "We believe in asking questions here," he said during our first visit. "Faith that can't withstand examination isn't worth holding." The congregation was small, maybe 40 people on a typical Sunday, but the warmth was genuine. No one pressured us to get baptized again or to make formal statements of faith. They simply welcomed us as fellow seekers trying to understand God's will in a complicated world. I found volunteer opportunities that gave my life new purpose. I began working with a local non-profit that provided legal advocacy for abuse survivors. My experience with religious institutional abuse proved valuable in helping other victims navigate the complex intersection of faith, community pressure, and justice. One Tuesday afternoon in January, I was staffing the organization's phone line when a young woman called, sobbing. "I need help," she said. "Something happened to me at my church. And when I tried to report it, they said I was lying, that I was trying to destroy a good man's reputation. Everyone I know thinks I'm the problem." I spent an hour on the phone with her, sharing resources, explaining her legal options, and most importantly, assuring her that she wasn't crazy, she wasn't lying, and she deserved to be believed and protected. After that call, I knew I'd found my new calling. By spring, Margaret and I had established new routines, new friendships, new ways of serving, others that didn't require organizational approval. We took weekend trips, something we'd rarely done as witnesses because of the emphasis on using free time for preaching. We read books that had been discouraged or forbidden. We celebrated our grandson's birthday for the first time, sending a gift, despite knowing it might complicate our daughter's situation in her congregation. In June, David called with news I'd been expecting but dreading. "Dad, Sarah asked me for a divorce. She said she can't be married to someone who's becoming an apostate. The elders told her it would be better for her spiritual welfare if she separated from me." The pain in my son's voice was heartbreaking. He was losing his wife, his stepchildren, his entire life structure because he'd chosen intellectual honesty over comfortable conformity. "I'm proud of you," I told him. "I know that doesn't make it hurt less, but I'm proud that you're choosing truth over convenience." "It's what you taught me, Dad. Maybe not intentionally, but your example showed me that some things are more important than keeping peace with people who demand you compromise your integrity." That summer, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who was working on a project about institutional abuse in religious organizations. She interviewed me for 3 hours, focusing on the organizational policies that had protected Harold Pierce and the personal costs of speaking out. "Mr. Miller, what would you say to other religious leaders who suspect abuse in their organizations but are afraid to speak up because of potential consequences?" I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. I'd tell them that protecting victims is always more important than protecting institutions. I'd remind them that every day they wait is another day an abuser has access to potential victims. And I'd assure them that while the personal costs of speaking out are real and significant, the costs of staying silent are even higher, not just for the victims, but for their own integrity and peace of mind. The documentary aired 18 months later on a national cable network. It featured 3 religious abuse cases, including Harold's, and examined how institutional policies in various faiths create environments where predators can flourish and victims are silenced. I received dozens of emails and phone calls after the broadcast, some supportive, some critical, many from people sharing their own experiences of religious abuse and institutional cover-ups. The most meaningful came from a woman in Oregon. "Mr. Miller, I saw your interview and wanted to thank. I was abused by a religious leader, and when I tried to report it, I was told I was mistaken, that I was letting Satan use me to attack God's servant. I believed them. I thought I was the problem. Seeing your story and Clara's gave me the courage to finally speak up. The man who abused me is finally facing consequences, and 2 other women have come forward with similar experiences. Thank you for showing us that sometimes God's will requires us to act against religious authority." On October 29, 2018, exactly 1 year after my disfellowshipping announcement, Margaret and I hosted a small dinner party. The guests included Clara Johnson, who was thriving in her social work program, Carmen Rodriguez, who had become a victim's advocate, several members of our new church congregation, and 3 other former Jehovah's Witnesses who had found new purpose after leaving the organization. As we sat around our dining room table sharing stories and laughter, I reflected on the year that had transformed our lives. Yes, we had lost friends, family relationships, and the comfortable certainty of belonging to what we'd believed was God's chosen organization. But we had gained something more valuable, the freedom to serve others without institutional constraints, the peace that comes from acting on conscience rather than authority, and the joy of authentic relationships with people who valued us for who we were, not for our compliance with organizational expectations. Clara raised her glass of apple cider and offered a toast. To people who choose justice over comfort, truth over authority, and love over loyalty to institutions that fail, the people they claim to serve. We all raised our glasses. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, Margaret and I sat on our front porch watching the sunset. The Kingdom Hall was visible in the distance, its parking lot filling with cars for the midweek meeting. "Do you ever miss it?" Margaret asked. "The certainty, the sense of belonging, the feeling that we had all the answers." I considered her question honestly. I miss the community, the shared purpose, the feeling that our lives had cosmic significance. But I don't miss the fear of questioning, the pressure to conform, or the weight of knowing that people were suffering while we prioritized organizational loyalty over basic human decency. As darkness settled over Red Hollow, lights began coming on in houses throughout our neighborhood. Behind those windows were families dealing with all the ordinary challenges of human existence, raising children, caring for aging parents, struggling with health issues, trying to find meaning and purpose in an uncertain world. Some of those families attended our former Kingdom Hall, still believing they had exclusive access to divine truth. Others belonged to various churches, synagogues, mosques, or no religious community at all, but all of them deserved to be protected from predators, respected as individuals, and treated with the kind of love that puts their welfare above institutional convenience. For 30 years, I had believed that serving God required absolute obedience to human religious authority. Now I understood that serving God sometimes requires the courage to stand against that very authority when it fails to protect the vulnerable. The legal case against Harold Pierce had been resolved, but the larger questions it raised about religious authority, institutional accountability, and individual conscience remained. How many other Harold Pierces were protected by organizational policies that prioritized reputation over safety? How many other Clara Johnsons were suffering in silence, afraid to speak truth to religious power? I couldn't answer those questions, but I could continue doing my part to create a world where victims are believed, predators are stopped, and people of conscience feel empowered to act on their convictions regardless of institutional pressure. We prepared for bed that night. I felt grateful, not for the pain we'd endured, but for the clarity it had brought. Margaret and I had discovered that life outside organizational walls could be richer, more authentic, and more genuinely spiritual than anything we'd experienced within them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve others, new ways to honor the courage that Clara Johnson had shown when she first asked for help. But tonight, I went to sleep with the deep peace that comes from knowing you've chosen correctly when every choice was difficult. This is a true story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'll be very happy to tell your story on our channel.